Welcome back to Intro to 3D Animation. Today we're going to explore basics of timeline animation in Maya, how to set keyframes, and just kind of how to navigate the really basic animation timeline system inside of Maya. We will get more advanced in the future. We're going to go into the graph editor. We're going to go into more advanced ways to set keys and how to control those keys in future lessons. But today, we're going to really just focus on the basics of setting keyframes and kind of getting used to how you can control some of the basic parameters of an object. So as you can see in this scene, I have set up, I just put in a plane, a ground plane. I put in a sphere. I gave it a texture with a checker pattern. So, that's just like a basic AI standard surface. You have an option on those standard surfaces to add a checker pattern to it. So that's what I did. I put in a checker pattern on it. Really simple stuff. The checker pattern is just to help me with rotation since it's a sphere. If it was just like a plain color, you could probably not tell that it was rotating. And that's what we're going to do today. We're going to do a little squash and stretch and rotation and position movements. So once you get that set up with your texture of choice, you don't need to put any lighting or anything in here yet. We're not doing any too much. We're going to do some basic rendering, but not too much here, okay? So let's talk about the timeline. We're just going with the Maya Classic workspace right now. If you're on Maya Standard, you'll notice there's no timeline at the bottom. That's more about just straight modeling. Let's start with Classic. I know there is a Maya Animation tab. It's probably very tempting, but this is probably also a little overwhelming for you yet. We will, like I said, get to the graph editor down the road. But between Maya Classic and the animation tab, you're going to be able to do a lot. I will say if you jump over to the animation one, you do get a separate key main menu up here that has a lot of things, and what's useful about it is all the little shortcut keys that are in here as well, which are very helpful moving forward. We're actually going to talk about insert a key on translate versus rotate versus scale and the differences there, setting keys and inserting keys and all sorts of different things like that. So you do get some extra things that you can play with up here. So if you're ever curious about those shortcut keys, pop up to the animation, then come back to Classic for this kind of reduced timeline. So this timeline is just like any timeline you've maybe explored in like Adobe Premiere or After Effects. I start at 0 frame and I can work out, right now I have it set to 500. You can control that at any point. I could say, I think by default it sets to 200 frames. I can zoom in on it by controlling this little guy. I can zoom in and say like I only want to look at 10 frames, or I want to look at like 1 to 10. So I could say like, let's put this, and then I'm only looking at 10 frames at a time. Or I can, let's look at the whole 200. And like I said, I can expand the range here with the second box and put in, no, I want 500 frames. 500 frames. So I can either do it this way and expand out to see the whole 500, or zoom in to just see a few, or I can say I want to see a range of frame 1 to frame 100. Type it in that first box. Now I'm going to see the first 100 frames. But anytime I want, I can expand back out. The other thing I like to mention to everybody right off the bat is kind of playback speed. Right now, if I play this, it's just going to kind of like zip through. And we want to do this at more real time than at like play every frame. So if I right click on the timeline and I go to playback speed, right now it's saying play every frame free. There's also this play every frame max real time. We're going to go right now to just real time, so we can just see it at 24 frames per second. If you want to change your frame rate, you can change it here. 24 is kind of a standard film animation frame rate, but you could go, if we scroll down, you can go to like 29.97, which is standard for video, or you can go 15 if you want kind of a choppy style animation. But we're going to stick with 24 for right now. So this is going to try to play 24 frames per second real time. Now, when things get really advanced and you've got multiple things animated that are complex, it's going to be hard for Maya to like preview everything in real time, and that's where we're going to try some of those other playback speeds. But for right now, it should be able to handle a basic object like this in motion in real time. All right. So the other thing I always like to say is, I can always just jump to places on the timeline, or I can dial it in. Over here on the right, I can dial in, go to frame 50, or go to frame 100. Or go to frame 200, and it's going to jump right where I want to go. So that's always nice to know, right? We're going to get to these playback controls here in a minute. Obviously, I showed you we can play back and stop at any point. We can use this arrow to go to the beginning, this arrow to go to the end, and then we're going to talk about these, which allow us to kind of jump along one frame at a time, and then these buttons will allow us to frame to keyframes, which we have some. Excuse me, I got a little head cold. So we're going to go to the beginning here, and we're going to go ahead and start. So right off the bat, I'm going to select my sphere, and I'm just going to set a general keyframe. And when I set a general keyframe, it is going to set a keyframe for position, rotation, and scale. Position also known as translate in Maya. I can either do that by just hitting the letter S on my keyboard. So if I hit S with it selected, you'll see up here in the attributes window, the attributes editor, you're going to see these turned red. That means a keyframe has been set for translate, rotation, and scale. You're also going to see a little red dial here, or red dash here on the timeline. That means a keyframe is set on that keyframe, or on that playback frame. I'm going to undo. You can also do it by going to the animation tab up here and hitting the set keyframe button. It's going to do the same thing. Now you can also, as a shortcut, you can come in here and set a keyframe for just translate, or just rotation, or just scale if you don't want to set one for all three. So maybe I'm just moving position around and I want to set a keyframe for just translate. You'll still see the red dash down here, but you're going to notice over in the attributes window it has only gone red for the translate. And if I back up on that, I can also do Option S or Alt S on a keyboard, and that will do the same thing as a shortcut. And remember where I said under animation, you can see those shortcuts. If you come up here to the workspace and go to animation and go to the key menu, you'll see where it is. Option W, Option E, and Option R to set keyframes for just those parameters. I'm going to go back to Classic. So again, I'm going to go ahead and undo and choose it and just see what happens when I do Option E. Whoops. Oh, I'm sorry. I said Option. It's Shift. My fault. It's not Option. It's the Shift S. Shift W, Shift E, and Shift R. My bad. So there's Shift W, undo for translate, Shift E for rotation, and Shift R for scale. Okay? So those are just ways to kind of target it if you're not going to do everything else. For today, we're going to do S in general, just setting keyframes, because I'm going to play around with all three of those parameters. So I'm going to hit S, and there's my first keyframe. Then I'm going to move forward on the timeline. I'm going to go to like frame 30. You know, I can always dial it in over here in the bottom right, or I can just move to frame 30 on the timeline. And I'm going to go ahead and move my object now. Move the sphere to the other side. Now it doesn't set a keyframe automatically unless I turn on auto keyframing. Some people like to work with auto keyframing because once you set one, then you can just move it around and then move to another position on the timeline. It'll automatically set keyframes, kind of the way After Effects does when you animate stuff. But if you want full manual control, leave that off. And now I'd hit S again, and now I have another key. You'll see there's two red dashes there. And if I go back to the beginning and play it, there it goes, moves across, pretty close to real time. Again, I'm going to undo and move it back to position, and watch what happens when I turn on auto keyframing. That's this button right here that's now red. I move to the position 30 on my timeline, and I just move it, and I automatically get a keyframe now for translate. You'll see that change there. So now I'm at like negative 2.84. And if I move again to keyframe 60, to 60 on the timeline, and then I move this guy again forward, it's going to set an automatic keyframe again. So if I go back to the beginning and play it, there we go. Now, again, if you like automatic, cool, turn on automatic. For the rest of this tutorial, I'm going to keep automatic off. I just like you to know about automatic. Sometimes automatic becomes a pain because it just sets all these keyframes you don't need, and you want to keep it a little leaner on the keyframes. So I'm going to turn that off for right now. And I'm going to go ahead and undo these guys. And then, yeah, I have to turn it off again. There we go. So I have my first keyframe. I'm going to move to that position again. I'm going to hit the letter S, and that sets keyframes for all three parameters. If I want, I could also scale it here and hit S again. If I had auto, it would have automatically updated that keyframe, but just hitting S in the same position will kind of overwrite the last keyframe. So there we go. We're scaling. The other thing I'm going to do, I'm going to go back to that keyframe. I'm using these little keyframe shortcuts to just go exactly to the last keyframe, which actually wasn't on 30. It was on 29. So that's good to know. So I'm going to go ahead and Bring that back to keyframe, not 1, but keyframe 29. And I'm going to go ahead and just rotate it a little bit as well. So I'm going to go there, go to E and rotate it, and hit S again. And now we're going to see it rotate as it expands up, right? And now we're at keyframe 70. That's cool. I'm going to go ahead and go back to my position tool on this guy. There we go. Translate tool. Bring it into the foreground and rotate it once again. And maybe a little bit in the other direction. And hit S. Let's see how that looks. Hey, not too bad. I was trying to pay attention to it like it was still sort of rolling at a little bit of an angle. So I actually rotated it in 2 different dimensions there. And then, I'll bring it over one more time. Let's go back to frame 70. I'm going to go up to like frame 100 this time. And I'm going to go ahead and move it one more time. Whoops, I had both of them. Sorry, let me grab just the sphere. I'm going to move it this way. And I'm going to rotate it this way now because it's kind of like rolling back again. And I'm also going to scale it back down. And let's just move it over just a hair more. There we go. And I'm going to hit S to set a keyframe. So let's take it back to the beginning and play it. Not too bad. So we're starting to get there. You're starting to understand kind of how we can lay out keyframes in some interesting ways, right? So we can start to really position these things and move around and just kind of start to lay them out. This is really, like I said, just a brief introduction to how we can start to set some keyframes. We're going to have lots more control once we move into the graph editor and we can start to move things around and really play with the fine-tuning of those keyframes. So now that we have some keyframes here, if you ever need to delete a keyframe, just go to that keyframe. So say I'm going to delete this one that's on keyframe 60. If I hold down Shift, I can actually, first of all, before I delete it, I can move it by grabbing these little arrows. So I had to Shift click it, and then I can move that to wherever I want. So I can say, let's move that to keyframe 60, or 62, or 63. And then, we're good to go on that, right? But I can also Shift click it and just delete it. Whoops, I deleted the whole object. I'm sorry. Shift click it and then right click on and say delete. And that'll delete just the keyframe, right? The other option that I have is, like I said, I can shift click it and then I can use these little yellow arrows that appear and I can move it around in a position of time, which is kind of cool. So let me grab the right one there. There we go. I think that'll move it. There we go. I have it now. And so I can move that to frame 80 instead and kind of change up the timing of my animation. You can also hold down Shift and drag a whole selection of keyframes. So I could grab all the keyframes in my sequence and I can move them that way. So I can then grab the whole group and move them. I can also scale them, which is really nice as a group. So just a nice feature there to keep in mind if I want to scale the timing of this whole thing or if I want to move the whole group of keyframes using the simple editor here. So now if I go back to the beginning, I click off of it, this is going to be a quicker. It stops for a second and then moves through and goes a little bit quicker. So let me not start right on the first frame. Now I'm starting around frame 25 or something like that. So shift clicking these little guys is definitely very important, and then you can move them around. But you have to really get right on the keyframe. So again, make sure you use these little arrows to get right on it. Let me click off of that one. So say I want to be on keyframe 23. I have to click right on it and then I can move it around. See how the red bar is now moving? And I can put that on frame 20 and then click off of it. Same thing here, shift click on, actually let's go ahead and click off of that and I'll go to use my arrows here. It's on frame 49. Actually, if I just drag on it, there we go. And then I can move that one over and get it onto frame 50. Actually, it's on frame 51. Let's move that over. Now I got it on frame 50. So it's a little tricky through here. It's definitely a lot easier through the graph editor to do these kind of little guys. I think that was it actually, 81. Let's see what frame that's on. It's actually 82. And then I can move that over to say frame 80. So I could really like time all these out so that they're just right. That one's 120. And then again, if I want, I can do a big shift drag and get all of them and move them so that they start wherever I want them, or scale them or stretch them out. Maybe I want to make this way longer, and then click off of them. Now it's a slower one that's kind of spread out. So some nice handy dandy tools in this basic editor, in the Maya Classic timeline editor, for you to manipulate your keyframes. Once we get into the animation panel here, you're going to be able to actually like see all these keyframes as curves, right? So we're going to actually be able to see the positions of them, and say I wanted to move these keyframes, I could grab all of them and move them over to frame 30. So the graph editor is really the advanced way we're going to be able to, but I'll just show this to you now just so you can kind of like tweak the positions of all these if you needed to. So like if I wanted to move these to a different kind of like timing point, we can do that. We can actually play with the curvature of these, which affects the motion. I don't want to get into this too much yet, but this is if you at least need to move your keyframes around. This is going to be the easiest way to do them and to be able to select individual keyframes. We haven't gone over how how this works exactly. This is a kind of a different system yet, so I don't want to get you too advanced. But at least if you need to change their positions, or if you need to delete some keyframes, you can always select them and delete them then, like that, and it's going to kind of move the motions around. I'm just going to undo that. So if I go back again and get to classic here, yep, we can still see our keyframes and go to the beginning. I switched up the timing a little bit. Whoop, see, I already messed up the one of them because I moved it up. So by playing around with the some of the timeline positioning, you've got to be careful in the graph editor, because you can mess around with positions and kind of like how deep they're moving. So I'm actually going to go ahead and move these all back to where they were. Even though I was just trying to move them kind of like on the time scale, I ended up messing with their positions a little bit. So let's see if that fixed it. Whoop. There we go. Now let's see if I can adjust these positions without screwing up. If you hold shift, yeah, we didn't play with the vertical dimension. Like if you move these up and down, you're now messing with values of those keyframes instead of like the positions on the timeline. So you have to really be careful that you don't go like up or down with them. See how that's changing the scale as I go up or down? So we really want to be careful and about that if you're going to move things around in different positions. So, you know, you have to be very aware and cognizant of that. But, you know, I just moved their positions. You can still delete keyframes that you want to and redo them, and that's an easy way to access that. All right, so let's go back to the classic. And last thing I'm going to do, I'm going to go ahead and save, and then I'm going to show you how to export this as an image sequence. And the image sequence is going to allow you to then bring this into After Effects and then export it as an MP4, etc. So let's click on the settings here, render settings. And first things first, let's set the image sequence to something else. We don't want EXRs right now. You could do TIFFs, but they're going to take up a lot of space. I'm just going to do JPEGs. And, you know, I'm going to actually switch to my software editor so I don't have to set up lighting and a bunch of other stuff here to make it look decent. And actually, that's switched to PNGs, but let's go back to JPEGs just to keep them smallest as possible. Right off the bat, I have to change the naming convention from just like a single frame to one with a number extension on it. And that's going to unlock start and end frame for me, which is basically like the duration of this thing. So I can set that. I basically want to give it a name dot number. So it has kind of an image sequence number to it that After Effects is going to recognize. And then I'm going to say start frame is 1, end frame. I think I ended around 100, so I'll go to end frame is the 100th frame. That's good to go. And then I want to set my, you know, resolution that I'm going to go with. And 1080 is important here. And actually, I'm going to turn on, just so we can see the framing of it. This should still work out pretty well for this animation. But I just turned on sort of my frame preview here just to kind of see how that was going to render out and make sure all the action in my animation. So I might change the camera before I render here for a second. But I've got the resolution. I could leave alpha on, but I don't need alpha, and JPEG doesn't support alpha, so I'm going to turn that off. We're going to stick with the perspective camera for now. So big important things: choosing your image format, getting the right name extension here with a number so that you can actually set your frames, and we should be good to go. And just so I can make sure that all the animation is happening within the frame. Oh yeah, we're good to go. Nice. Now, we are going to go to Render tab here, and we're going to want to make sure we do the render sequence. So, also we want to make sure we know where we're actually rendering this to, right? So always remember to go to your project window and decide where you're going to save this. So I'm going to save it to my desktop. It's going to make a new folder. That's fine. I'm going to accept, but otherwise it's going to go to like a default folder somewhere. So I'm going to go ahead and accept that, and I'm going to render my sequence, and there it goes. It's rendering out all the individual frames. I don't have anything too complex going on here, so obviously it's not having to spend a lot of time on each render, but you can see it's progressing with that flashing pattern going on right now. And in just a minute, I should have 100 frames or 100 frames worth of animation going on here, which isn't a whole lot. You know, it's only roughly 5 seconds or around 4 seconds, a little over 4 seconds of animation. Almost done. Excellent. Looks like it had some runtime error, but hopefully that didn't interfere with it. And I go to my desktop. Here's the temporary folder, and there they all are, nice and numbered in order. And I can kind of progress through them and see my whole animation. And what's great is now when I go to into After Effects, or my compositing software of choice, I'll go ahead and open it up and show you just quickly how to do an import on this. You're going to be able to import it, but it is important to make sure that usually it just automatically recognizes an image sequence, but I'm going to go ahead and create a new composition. We'll set this at standard 1080p HD, 24 frames per second to match. And let's just say that this is 10 seconds long as well, roughly. Hit OK. And I'm going to go ahead and import. If I go to my desktop and go to that temporary folder, if I click on one, you want to make sure that you just click on this import JPEG sequence. And that's going to see, because if you don't, it's just going to import them as like single images. But if you do this as an image sequence and hit open, it's actually going to bring them all in and treat it like an animation. So now if I bring this down onto my timeline, oh, it's not very long. Whoops, there we go. Sorry, I put it at 10 seconds when it was really only about 4 seconds long. But there's my whole animation, right? So there it is, playing close to real time there. So not too bad. I would want to obviously adjust my timeline to match that, or I'm sorry, my composition settings to match that. So I had it at 10 minutes. Whoopsie. I thought I was doing 10 seconds. I was in the wrong position there, but this is really only about 4 seconds long. So there we go. It's a little under that. And then I've got my whole series to work with. And now obviously I can export that to Media Encoder, save it out as a MP4 file or my, export movie format of choice. I can do some compositing tricks on it, all sorts of different things. So hopefully that gets you started with how to lay out some keyframes, how to control position, scale, rotation, how to set those keyframes, how to overwrite keyframes, how to tweak them a little bit with some beginning stuff in the graph editor. Like I said, our future lesson here in the very near future, we're going to dive into the graph editor because that's really going to give you ultimate control over these various keyframes that you're laying out and their positions and whatnot. So thanks for tuning in, and reach out if you have any questions.